I thought they might be counting the money by weight, so I thought the hearing aid batteries would help out a little bit. Well, some of my fondest memories include the 20 hunting seasons beginning in the early 1990s that I was fortunate enough to spend on the Knoll Farm in Ohio. And unlike the years that Dave Knoll and I spent duck hunting prior to that, where my wife and I would joke that the ducks that I did manage to bring home cost about $70, $80 a piece, I think that the deer that I shot actually did help our family. It was certainly a boon to Sandy's grocery budget. Now, Mr. Knoll spent an inordinate amount of time and effort ensuring that all those who were invited had a good chance of taking a deer, whether it be a doe for the freezer or the occasional trophy buck. At the end of each day's hunt, after dinner, while sitting around a blazing fire built in an old tractor rim, he would go around and he'd ask each person to describe their day, what animals happened to pass by their tree stand while they were hunting, or any deer they happened to see, or if they didn't see any deer. And especially he wanted to know the details if they were fortunate enough to take a deer that day. Now, these conversations, after a long, usually cold, sometimes rainy day, were the ideal way to cap off a fantastic day spent in the woods. And the topics, of course, varied. Old hunting tales were told, humorous stories, mishaps and triumphs, some way more elaborate than others, and I think Dave knows what I'm talking about. But all of them were enjoyable. Often these conversations migrated towards the more serious, including deep discussions about church and religion among the number of ministers who were usually present. Mr. Knoll was a minister. One such discussion that I remembered involved how the church seemed to be more liberal these days than it had been in its earlier years. And I distinctly recall Mr. Knoll's take on the situation. He made the comment that the church, and indeed God's people throughout history, have always been like a pendulum. At times, the pendulum swings way out to the left before it comes back and centers itself, and at other times, it swings way out to the right. But it always is seeking the center, the middle of the road, if you will. And of course, history bears this out. From the lackadaisical to outright rebellious attitude of some of the kings of Israel and Judah, as we heard in the first split, that would be a pendulum swing to the left, compared to the hypocrisy of the Pharisees at the time of Christ, a swing entirely to the right. Now, this swing from left to right, but always seeking center, doesn't have to be limited to the church in general, but it can involve certain aspects of the church or us as individuals. A lot of this, of course, comes from a natural progression of time. For instance, we don't hear as many sermons today about child rearing as we did back in the 1970s, primarily because there just aren't as many young families with children coming into the church as there were back then. Today, it seems that most of the growth is coming from within, from people who have grown up with the principles taught them in those earlier years. The pendulum has found its center when it comes to this subject. Now, unfortunately, I can attest to this pendulum swing in my own life when it came to child rearing. When I first came into church in the early 70s, one of my friends complained vehemently about how on Friday evenings after dinner, their father would read to him and his siblings out of the Bible for hours. And it was obvious that it influenced how he felt about the church in a negative way. He ended up leaving the church the first chance he got. So I decided early on that I was not going to be that kind of father to my kids, and I took a more relaxed approach when it came to teaching them. Now, of course, we had the YES lessons, and which they all participated, and there was the Bible memory. But in retrospect, I realized that it just wasn't enough. I had let the pendulum swing past center and too far the other direction. Now, I'm sure we can all realize areas in the church and in our own lives where this is true. Prayer, fasting, keeping the Sabbath, Bible study can all be examples. At times, we are far more studious with these than we are at other times. And one area I think that we might let the pendulum swing from one extreme to the other, and what I want to focus on today, is that of cleaning for the days of unleavened bread and preparing for the Passover, because the two are interrelated. To illustrate how this can be a swing to the right, a few years ago when I was contracting as a cable splicer for the phone company down in Fort Myers, Florida, I hired a friend from the church as a splicer's helper. And there was many jobs that required two people to do this, so he was a natural choice. He and his family were new to the area, new to the church, and they were roughly the same age as my wife and I, so we ended up becoming good friends. He related to me one day at work how hard of a time his wife was having cleaning for unleavened bread. And when I inquired about it further, he said that the day before she was cleaning out the kids' closet and had gotten down the Monopoly game. She was afraid that the boys may have eaten a sandwich or eaten some cookies while playing the game, so she took great pains to vacuum off each and every piece of Monopoly money, just to make sure there was no leavened crumbs on any of it. Now, on hearing this, I thought, wow, at that rate, she probably should have started cleaning sometime after the previous Pentecost. Now, was that a bit extreme? Well, I would think so, but one would have to admire her sincerity at trying to obey God. Now, on the other hand, is God pleased if, by our efforts, if all we do is just go to the pantry, throw out a couple boxes of crackers a few hours before we leave for Passover? Well, naturally, I think the answer lies somewhere in between. In April of 2007, just prior to the Spring Holy Days, I gave a sermonette entitled, "Why Do We Clean?" Apparently not one of my best efforts. I took a little bit of heat for it from some of the members of the congregation. Now, perhaps I didn't explain myself as thoroughly as I should have. Now, I'm not going to repeat that sermonette, but in my conclusion, I do want to hit on a few points I made and clarify them somewhat. So again, at the risk of digging myself into yet a deeper hole, I'll ask the question, why do we clean? Are we required by God to do so, or is cleaning our houses prior to unleavened bread, if one indeed does so, just a church tradition? Well, personally, cleaning my house this time of year has always been a part of my life, even prior to coming into God's church. My mother always seemed to do a major cleaning of our home in the spring of the year. My job always seemed to involve washing all the screens of our house. We had a large Florida room that had floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 walls. There were a lot of screens to wash. As much as I disliked that job, I remember thinking after it was done, wow, that really does look a lot better. I suppose that's why my wife and I, and I'm sure many of you, combine cleaning for unleavened bread with spring cleaning. In fact, preparing this message, while I was preparing this message, I looked up the origins of spring cleaning, and I was surprised by a common thread that ran through almost all of them. The first site I went to, believe it or not, was bobwille.com. I'm sure many of you will recall him from the numerous TV shows that he hosted about home improvement. The article I read was entitled, "Why Do We Clean in the Spring?" And it was typical of many of the sites that I visited. I'll read a short clip from the article as it appeared. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, spring cleaning dates back to biblical times. According to the book of Exodus, the Israelites had to leave Egypt in such a hurry that they did not have time for bread to rise and had to rely on unleavened bread for their journey. During Passover, to commemorate the liberation of the Israelites, the Torah requires that no traces of leaven, called shemetz, be left in the house, and it takes a heap of cleaning to get out every crumb. The article went on to mention other cultures as well that has the same custom of cleaning in the spring. In Persia, modern-day Iran, they celebrate the holiday of Nowruz. The 13-day celebration includes, among other customs, the practice called, and I'm going to butcher this word, kena tekeni, which means shaking the house. Everything gets cleaned, and the dust of the old year is swept away and replaced with fresh flowers. In Japan, they practice osoji, or big cleanup, during Japan's Golden Week, a period of 7 days from late April to early May, at which time their homes get a thorough cleaning. History.com has this to say on the subject. It's not enough to just abstain from leavened foods during Passover. Observant Jews purge their homes of every trace and crumb of shemetz, or leavened products, often using the process as an excuse for some deep spring cleaning. So were the days of unleavened bread the origins of spring cleaning? Well, I tend to doubt it. It just seems natural to want to open up your house when the weather turns nice and clean it up after a long winter. But perhaps it is possible that it took on more significance because of these days and their history. Of course, we need to look no further than our own Bibles for the origin of these days and cleaning. And turn with me, if you will, to Exodus chapter 12. Exodus chapter 12, and we'll begin in verse 15. Exodus 12, verse 15. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. Verse 19. For 7 days no leaven shall be found in your house. Since whoever eats what is leavened, that same person shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he is a stranger or native in the land. The Bible in basic English reads verse 15 this way. For 7 days let your food be unleavened bread. From the first day, no leaven is to be seen in your houses. We remove leavening and leavened products from our homes because God tells us to do so. But again, this begs the question, why would God be concerned if we, living in the 21st century, have bread in our pantry during these days, or whether there's a Ritz cracker hiding somewhere in the recesses of our recliners? And one reason I think can be found in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. We'll turn there. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 46. 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 46. However, the spiritual is not first, but the natural, and afterward the spiritual. God often uses physical examples to teach spiritual lessons. The Passover is a prime example. We all know the symbolism that lie behind the bread and the wine that we'll partake of that evening. Yet God has us go through the same procedure every year. The physical act of eating the bread and drinking the wine reminds us of the sacrifice that was made on our behalf. You know, I'm a physical human being. I do not comprehend the concept of eternal life or having lived forever. Someday I will, but until then, God uses physical lessons to teach me spiritual concepts. In the same manner, removing leavening from our homes reminds us of the importance of removing sin from our lives. To quote from page 28 of our church's booklet, From Holidays to Holy Days, God's Plans for You, it reads, removing leaven from our homes gives us an object lesson in the work and challenge involved in removing sin from our lives. Hard to find leaven reminds us that we need to carefully examine our lives for sin, repent, and seek God's help to remove it. 2 Corinthians 13:5 tells us that we're to examine ourselves in preparation for the Passover. Now, obviously, we don't do this as the Passover service begins. It's a process, just as preparing for the Feast of Tabernacles is a process. We prepare all year by saving our tithes, making our hotel reservations and travel plans. We prepare for all of God's holy days by hearing messages prior to them so that we can get our mind thinking about their importance. The real question we have to ask ourselves, though, is how zealously do we want to go about getting the leavening out of our homes and likewise the sin out of our lives? Let's turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 5, and we'll read verses 6 through 8. Back a few pages, 1 Corinthians 5, and we begin in verse 6. Your glorying is not good. Do you know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Verse 7, therefore purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you truly are unleavened. For indeed Christ our Passover was sacrificed for us. Therefore let us keep the feast, not with the old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Dictionary.com defines this word, purge, that Paul uses in verse 7 as to rid of whatever is impure or undesirable. Collins English Dictionary defines it to cleanse or rid of impurities, foreign matter, and undesirable elements, to remove by cleansing. Now, obviously, Paul is referring here to the leaven of sin, but it's easy to see how the analogy between sin and leavening can be applied to our households as well. It's obvious to us that sin is impure and undesirable, that we need to strive to cleanse our lives of it. And since this is an analogy, it would stand to reason that we should strive to make a concerted effort at cleansing the leavening out of our homes as well. And there are advantages to doing this. Yes, it is work, but removing sin from our lives require work as well. It's time-consuming. At times it can be relatively easy, while at other times it can be a very tedious process. But then again, so is overcoming sin. The upside, however, is that by cleaning our homes and cars, striving to get out any leavening, keeps our minds focused on the more important task of ridding our lives of sin. As I'm vacuuming out a couch or under the seat of my car, I'm focused on what I'm doing, the task at hand. I'm constantly thinking about removing leavening from my property and its analogy of removing sin from my life. I could never approach this level of concentration and examination by, let's just say, going for a walk and thinking about it. Now, I may start out with the best of intentions, but no sooner would I see a blue-gray gnatcatcher or an old Jeep and I'd lose all train of thought. You know, it's the old look, something shiny syndrome. I've proved this way too many times to myself. Back when I was still able to go on walks comfortably 3 or 4 miles, I would take that time to pray. And I guess perhaps meditate might be a better word for it, because it seems I was constantly having to remind myself to get back on track. There's a reason that we get on our knees to pray. So as opposed to just throwing away our bread and crackers just before these days begin, a systematic cleaning of our homes allows us to be thinking about the sins that may not be obvious even to ourselves. Little things that we do that may not technically be a sin, but things that if they weren't in our lives, we'd be better people for it. And really, it's these type of sins that require us to examine ourselves. If a person is struggling with some blatant sin, he or she may need to examine themselves at a different level and consider how to overcome it. But that's the obvious sin. That's the loaf of bread in the freezer that we know we have to get rid of. On the other hand, we examine ourselves for the little things in our lives that may keep us from being the type of person that God would want in his family. And this list can indeed be endless. Sins like having a bad attitude towards your spouse, a coworker, or your job, sarcastic words, or a propensity to argue, a rolling of the eyes, the silent treatment, or just simple impatience can all be considered little sins, if indeed there is such a thing. Being too judgmental may also fall into this category. This occurred to me 2 weeks ago on the way home from church. I had to take a road that I wasn't familiar with, and I suddenly found myself in a right turn only lane. I put my blinker on to try to merge left, just as several other cars were trying to do. A lady behind me did the same thing, but then she sped up to prevent me from merging over. I thought to myself, really? I mean, we weren't going anywhere. What was a 2-lane road is now a 1-lane entrance ramp. As she whipped around me, I did manage, to give her the look. But she didn't even see it. She wasn't looking at me, which immediately made me think, wow, well, maybe I judged too quickly. I mean, she very well could have been looking behind her to merge just as I was. It was raining, and perhaps she didn't see my blinker. Was that technically a sin? Well, maybe it was. But even if it wasn't, it was something I felt that I would like to improve on. I've noticed myself, and I'm sure my wife will say the same thing, being very judgmental about a lot of things lately. Maybe it's coming with my age and losing hearing aid batteries. But it's something that I'm working on. It was typical of the crumbs of leavening buried between the cushions of the couch. I need to get rid of it. More to the point, though, let's turn to the book of James, chapter 4, and we'll read verse 17. James 4, verse 17. Therefore, to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is a sin. We're all familiar with the parable of the Samaritan who helped the man who was robbed, wounded, and left for dead. Did the priest and the Levite actually sin by crossing to the other side of the road? Now, I would have thought not. I would have thought, hey, okay, well, they weren't very nice people. But I didn't think that they had actually committed a sin. However, the scripture we just read contradicts that. The priest and the Levite knew how to do good, but chose not to do so. So technically, they sinned. Is it possible that we sin when we have the opportunity to help somebody and we don't do it? These are the inconspicuous sins that we're trying to look for, sins that we are examining ourselves for prior to these days. Thoroughly cleaning for unleavened bread makes you think deeply about your own character and where you may come up short. For instance, one year I was cleaning out the closet in the bedroom. Now, one would think, okay, there isn't any leavening in my closet. But, it's not like I go in there and eat sandwiches. But I was cleaning the rest of the room, and I didn't want to leave the closet undone. Up on the shelf, I noticed an MRE. In case you're not familiar with the acronym, it stands for Meals Ready to Eat. It's the rations that are used in the military. They're sealed in a heavy beige plastic bag, and they can last for years. Without a doubt, that MRE had been sitting on that shelf for 3 or 4 or more years. I never gave it a thought. This year, for whatever reason, I decided to check out the ingredients. Now, as you may have surmised by now, there were crackers in it and some kind of cake that was inside. That thing had sat on that shelf through several years of spring holy days. And immediately I thought, wow, could this be indicative of some sin that I may have had in my life for years and I wasn't even aware of it? It makes you wonder. Now I realize, of course, that there are some who will counter that you can never totally remove leavening from your homes, no more than we can totally remove sin from our lives. And this is probably true. There will always be somewhere in our houses where leavening is hiding, whether up on a shelf in your closet or under a stove. However, a less accurate statement about leavening is that it's in the air. It's every time you open the front door, you're letting leavening in. Yes, yeast spores and bacteria are in the air, but they don't become leavening agents until they find a host, i.e. moist dough. Each year I make several batches of unleavened bread. I've never been crazy about sandwiches on matzahs. The bread I make is soft and pliable, something like pita bread. I'll make up a batch of it, which makes about 6 or 7 pieces of bread, about 8 inches in diameter, which I then fry in a cast iron griddle. The problem I run into is I can only do 1 or 2 at a time. And I'm often reminded of Mr. Sinon's sermon from a year or 2 ago about the Jewish requirement of kai, which means alive. In Hebrew, it's a 2-letter word that uses the 8th letter chet and the 10th letter yod. Added together, they come up to 18, or 18 minutes until dough becomes alive and begins to rise due to airborne leavening such as yeast, spores, and bacteria. Now with that in mind, let's turn to Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 2. Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 2. And when you once walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit who now works in the sons of disobedience. Satan is clearly the prince and power of the air. And just as yeast and bacteria are floating around our kitchens looking for hosts, so too are Satan and his demons. They're looking for hosts who are willing to allow sin into their lives. For instance, it's one thing for us to be watching a television show and something inappropriate for a Christian to watch comes on the screen. But it's quite another thing if you're seeking out that kind of programming. We are then allowing ourselves to be hosts to sin or leavening. When making my bread, I try to make short work of frying that dough, and it usually only takes a few minutes to get it all cooked. But if I allowed it to sit on that countertop for a few hours, then there's a good chance that it would probably start to rise. It's imperative that we don't allow ourselves to become hosts to sin. And once again, cleaning for the days of unleavened bread reminds us of that. Well, another point I'd like to make, I'd like to have us consider, is how big of a job it is for us to clean our homes compared to how much work it might have taken the Israelites to clean theirs. Houses of ancient Israel were modest affairs at best. There's a term used for them by archaeologists. They're simply called 4-room houses. Taking up most of this space would have been a large open courtyard where animals could be sheltered. Now, either at the back or the side of this 30 by 40 enclosure would be a series of small rooms under a roof, usually 3 or 4. If a family was exceptionally prosperous, their houses might include a second story. But either way, by our standards, they would have been meager dwellings indeed. So how much trouble would it have been for them to thoroughly clean for the Passover, as they would have called this week? Sweep the floors, shake out a few rugs, wash the linens, bam, you're done. I would imagine it could have been done easily in a day. Now compare that with the job that we have to do in our homes today. Could you just imagine how awestruck an Israeli housewife from that era would be if she walked into even the most modest of one of our homes? It makes you wonder why God would make cleaning our houses so much more difficult than he made ancient Israel houses to clean. And I think the answer to that, at least in part, lies in the book of Luke. Let's turn to Luke chapter 12, and we'll read the last half of verse 48. Luke chapter 12, and the last half of verse 48. For everyone to whom much is given, from him much will be required, and to whom much has been committed, of him they will ask the more. Think for a moment what we've been given that they didn't have. Just look at the amenities we enjoy. Comfortable bed, large screen TVs, computers with access to the internet, gaming system, and luxuries beyond description. And that's just in the kids' bedroom. How jubilantly do you think ancient Israel would have been how much would they have appreciated refrigeration or air conditioning? How about automobiles? How about automobiles with air conditioning? But that's just the physical, and none of that really matters. Of far more importance is what we've been given spiritually. First and foremost, we have Christ's sacrifice, and this in itself gives us so much. It gives us the opportunity to be forgiven of our sins. It gives us direct access to God the Father with Jesus as our intercessor. And it gives us the Holy Spirit, God's power to help us in our struggles. They had none of these things. Make no mistake about it, we have been given much. Therefore, so much more is required of us. If that involves more work on our part to clean our houses, and likewise rid our lives of sin, then so be it. It's the price we have to pay, and well worth it, one might add. In the Jewish community, and I would assume by that Orthodox Jews, they have an interesting custom called Birkat Shemetz. They perform this ceremony after cleaning their houses for unleavened bread. And while there are some variations, and aside from a little bit of explanation, I'll read it as I read it from a Jewish website. It goes something like this. On the evening before Passover, and of course we have to consider that their definition of Passover and ours differ significantly, as soon as the sun is down, and some sites said as soon as you see 3 stars, you are to gather the household together, light a candle, and recite the following blessing. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us by his commandments and has commanded us concerning the removal of shemetz. Next, the article goes on to say, hold the lit candle and search for shemetz in every room, as well as any other area of the home that may have shemetz, such as the basement, attic, garage, or car. Even once a house is thoroughly cleaned, there is often still a bagel crust or a Cheerio hiding in some overlooked cranny. When you're done, take all the shemetz that was found in the search, wrap and seal it securely, and place it in a conspicuous spot. This shemetz will be joined with all the remaining shemetz in your home and burned the next morning. Food intended to be sold or eaten later should similarly be put aside. When you've completed the search and done your best to get rid of any possible shemetz, gather the family back together and recite another word I'm not going to get right, Kol Kamira declaration translated below, nullifying all unknown shemetz and relinquishing it from your ownership. And this reads as follows. All leavening or anything leavened which is in my possession, which I have neither seen or removed, and about which I am unaware shall be considered nullified and ownerless as the dust of the earth. Then at the end of the article, there was a link stating, click here to purchase a Birkat Shemetz kit, which as far as I could tell included a candle, a wooden spoon, a paper bag, and a feather. I couldn't find out the origins of this ceremony, but today it's mostly done as symbolism. The children of the household are to carefully hide 10 small pieces of bread, about the size of a marble each, carefully laid out on napkins throughout the house in relatively easy-to-find places, such as bookshelves, kitchen cabinets, that sort of thing. Then on this evening, they ceremoniously gather the bread with a feather and a wooden spoon and place it in the paper bag to be burned in the next morning. I thought it was a cute custom, and the video that I watched about it made it clear that this was to be a fun activity for the children, which also had the advantage of teaching them the importance of de-leavening one's home for these days. So as I wrap this up, I'd like to end where I began, and that is with a sermonette that I gave 17 years ago in which I wasn't entirely clear. Most of the heat that I took over that involved me pulling out appliances to clean behind them. But yes, I still pull the stove and refrigerator out to clean behind them at my house for unleavened bread. I'm capable of doing so I do it. Every year, I'm amazed how much the cabinets on either side of that stove require this. Is there any of it leavening? Well, maybe, maybe not. On the same token, would I expect my mother or any other elderly widow in the church to do the same? Of course not. Someday, probably sooner than I would like to admit, I may not be able to pull that refrigerator out either. It has gotten to be noticeably heavier over the last few years. I think what it comes down to is that we are required to do what we can and as much as we can, as long as we're learning the lessons that I believe these days were intended to teach us, and that is to do everything in our power to rid our lives of sin. It's counterproductive to work oneself so hard that you don't get the full impact of how important Passover is each year. Now, we realize that there are plenty of places in our house that we just can't access. I'm not disconnecting my water heater to clean underneath it. And likewise, you may be in the position of our pastor and his wife. Chuck and I are thoroughly convinced that his refrigerator cannot be pulled out far enough to get behind it to clean. After a hurricane a couple of years ago, I called Chuck to see if he needed some help with anything. I had gotten the cable TV working at my house for my wife and mother-in-law, so I was golden. He said he could use some help. So I went down there, and he couldn't get his refrigerator. He couldn't find the breaker that his refrigerator was tied to get electricity to it. So I went down there, and we worked on it for an hour, hour and a half with no progress. So we decided to just pull the refrigerator out and run an extension cord to it. The problem that we ran into was that we couldn't get the refrigerator out of the nook that it rests in. The countertop on the kitchen island prohibits this. Now, I know that Deneen and Tom Kasherik and a few others here think that we're a couple of dweebs who can't tie a square knot, but we even took the doors off of that refrigerator. That's not an easy task with today's modern appliances. And we still were 3 inches from getting it out. Now, they claim that the countertop and that kitchen island was there when they brought the refrigerator in. Someday, when that refrigerator does die, we're going to sit back and see if it can actually be done. So I'll be the first to admit, if it's so, that I was wrong. Until then, though, I'm sticking to my story. So does God hold the Sinans accountable for not de-leavening their home? Let's say if there is a Ritz cracker hiding behind that refrigerator? Of course not. No more than he would hold my 90-year-old mother-in-law accountable for not being able to pull out her refrigerator and cleaning behind it. It will be fun, though, to see Deneen's face when she sees all those little leavened crackers that I've been throwing behind the refrigerator over the years. The bottom line is we do what we can, and in the interim, we learn the lesson that as hard as we might try, we are human. We do make mistakes. We can't get all the sin out of our lives, but we do everything we possibly can do to try to achieve that goal. And to do this, God has given us the analogy of cleansing our homes of leavening. We should use it to the best of our ability. There is a middle of the road to travel here. Let's strive to center the pendulum rather than letting it swing too far to the left or too far to the right as we work to rid our homes of leavened products while simultaneously striving to remove sin from our lives.